Good morning, guys. Welcome back. Before we dive in, just a reminder from your bio mentors of this event coming up next week. I believe you can RSVP if you want in the to the announcement. The link to RSVP is in the announcement that got sent out. So this is just a reminder. Today we're going to wrap up our examination of phylogenies and how we build phylogenies, how we evaluate phylogenies. You're going to know so much about evolutionary relationships by the end of today's lecture. So we're going to start off, we're going to pick up basically where we left off last time. That is, how can we reconstruct the traits that the most recent common ancestor of a group probably had, and how we can use an outgroup to do that. I'll talk for a bit about the principle of parsimony, which some of you may have encountered in your philosophy classes, but it actually turns out to apply really well to phylogenetic analysis. I'll talk about the problem of homoplasy. What do we do if we have similarities that don't actually reflect recent common ancestry? And then for the last 10 minutes or so of the class, I've just pulled some exam level questions, literally from previous years' final exams. I thought we could work through them as a group and get yourselves practiced in that way. Okay, so where were we last Tuesday? We were on this idea of popping off about cladistic analysis, and not all similarities are equally informative, and really we should only be paying attention to synapomorphies, traits that are shared and derived. Those are the ones that will provide us with the best information about evolutionary relationships. And it's very easy to see whether a trait is shared. It seems at first harder to tell whether a trait is derived versus ancestral. How do we know what the most recent common ancestor of the group had if we don't have it, preserved in the fossil record? Well, it turns out we can use the principle of outgroup analysis. And what do I mean by an outgroup? It's something that is a relative, not too distant relative, of the group of interest. So we want the outgroup to be distantly enough related to the in-group so that we're confident that that the outgroup has to have branched off from all of these in-group taxa farther back in evolutionary time than, say, A, B, C, D began branching off from each other. So the outgroup is equally closely related to everyone in the in-group. Or put another way, the outgroup is equally distantly related to everyone in the in-group. The outgroup can't be part of the in-group. So we don't want it to be, super closely related. We also don't want the outgroup to be extremely, overly, distantly related. So imagine that we were trying to work out the evolutionary relationships. If A, B, C, and D were species of like big cat, like tigers and lions and jaguars and leopards, who's most closely related to whom. You wouldn't want to use another cat species as an outgroup, probably, but you also wouldn't want to use like an amoeba or a sycamore tree. You might use something like a wolf or a fox. So the outgroup is somewhat closely related to the in-group, but not actually part of the in-group. That's the level of distance that we're really looking for. And then we can simply say, okay, what's the distribution of traits we have within the in-group? And is that trait also found in the out-group? Yes or no? And that can lead us to, not with 100% certainty, but with reasonable confidence, we can make sensible conclusions about whether this trait is probably ancestral or probably not. That is, did the most recent common ancestor of this whole group probably have the trait? Is it an ancestral trait? Or did the most recent common ancestor of the whole group probably not have the trait, and so it's derived? Ancestral versus derived. And so imagine that you were wanting to make a phylogeny, reconstruct evolutionary relationships among different species of butterfly. And say you wanted to use the number of legs that an adult butterfly has as one of your traits. And there's variation among butterflies. A lot of butterflies as adults have 6 legs. So like this orange palm dart butterfly, the number of legs is 6. But there's also some butterflies, like monarch butterflies, that have 4 legs. And so we're like, well, which is derived and which is ancestral? And the way that we can answer that is to examine an outgroup. So for an outgroup, we might use something like a moth, or in this case, we're going to use a caddisfly, another species of insect. So it's sort of closely related to butterflies, but it's not actually itself a butterfly. And it turns out caddisflies have 6 legs. Thus, the most likely explanation is that 6 legs is the ancestral state. The most recent common ancestor of all the butterflies, plus also these other insects, probably had 6 legs. And then for some reason, at some point in evolutionary time, the lineage leading to monarch butterflies transitioned from 6 legs, the ancestral state, to 4 legs, the derived state. Now, I say probably because outgroup analysis isn't 100% foolproof. It is possible that maybe 4 legs is the ancestral state, and at some point the lineage leading to caddisflies and other insects evolved an extra pair of legs. And then also independently, the lineage leading to orange palm dart butterflies evolved an extra pair of legs. But that is a more complicated explanation. That requires more things to happen. And we think that that is probably less likely. So probably the ancestral state is having 6 legs, and 4 legs is a more derived state of recent evolutionary origin that happened perhaps just once in the lineage leading to monarch butterflies. And so you'll notice that if this is true, then it shows that evolution doesn't always proceed in the direction of greater complexity. Because we could think of, well, isn't having 6 legs, isn't that like a more complex, 6 legs is more complex than 4 legs? And yet it appears as though at some point some of these butterflies transition from 6 to 4 legs. So outgroup analysis, we can work through a few examples. So if anytime that you are given like a number of species in the in-group, say that there's 5 taxa in the in-group here, and we've got also an out-group that is sort of equally distantly or equally closely related to everyone in the in-group, we can make these conclusions. We can be pretty confident that a trait is either ancestral or derived, depending on how it is distributed between the outgroup and the in-group. So imagine that for all of these taxa, including the outgroup, which is sharks on this slide, imagine that for all of these taxa, we're looking at a trait like having a backbone. And every single taxon represented on this tree has that trait. So this is a trait. If a trait is present in the outgroup and it's also universally present in the in-group, yeah, I don't have the clicker set up for this one. Just raise your hand if you think it's ancestral, probably ancestral. Yeah, I would agree. A trait like this is probably ancestral. The most likely explanation is that the most recent common ancestor of everybody, so the whole in-group plus the out-group, probably this guy had a backbone as well, and this is why all of its descendants have that trait. Is it possible that actually having a backbone is not an ancestral trait? It's possible. Maybe this most recent common ancestor did not have a backbone, and it was independently evolved in this lineage, and at least once in this lineage, maybe multiple times. But that is probably less likely. So probably a distribution like this, the trait is going to be ancestral. Similarly, if a trait is present in the outgroup, and some, but maybe not all members of the in-group have it, raise your hand if you think it's probably ancestral. Okay, and raise your hand if you think it's probably derived. And again, this is another of these examples where we may not know with 100% certainty, and so we'll use like terms like probably, this is most likely to be an ancestral trait. So the most likely explanation, which is also the simplest explanation, is that the most recent common ancestor did have the trait, so this trait is ancestral. That's why the outgroup has it. That's why these members of the in-group have it. The only thing we have to explain is at some point in time, the lineage leading to these two things must have lost the trait. That is the most likely explanation. So probably a trait that is present in the outgroup and some of the in-group is ancestral. What about a trait that is, okay, a trait that is present in some of the in-group and it's not found in the outgroup? Raise your hands if you think this is probably ancestral. And raise your hands if you think it is probably derived. Yes, I think so too. Again, we don't know for sure, but the most likely explanation is that the most recent common ancestor of the whole assemblage here, even including the shark outgroup, probably the most recent common ancestor did not have the trait. And so the trait was derived, that is, it appeared at some point probably in this stretch of evolutionary time, bless you, in this lineage leading to these three taxa. So a distribution like this is most likely to be a derived trait. Okay, what if the trait is present in the outgroup and nobody in the in-group has it? Is that probably ancestral? Is it probably derived? Is it like equally likely to be either? Yeah, I would agree with that. For a distribution of traits like this, we simply cannot tell with any degree of confidence whether a trait is probably ancestral or probably derived. And this is because there are two equally good explanations for why the outgroup has a trait and nobody in the in-group does. So maybe the trait is ancestral. So this guy here had the trait, and that's why the outgroup has it. And then the trait was lost at some point, maybe before the members of the in-group began splitting off from each other. That's one evolutionary step. One thing has to happen. The trait has to disappear for some reason in the in-group lineage. But maybe it's equally likely, I would say, that the trait is derived. And so maybe the most recent common ancestor of the whole group did not have the trait, and that's why nobody in the in-group has the trait. But at some point in time, the lineage leading to the outgroup evolved the trait. That is also one evolutionary step. One thing has to happen. In this case, it's the gain or the appearance of the trait, because the outgroup can evolve as well. And so there's two equally likely explanations here. Maybe the trait is derived, maybe the trait is ancestral. Neither one of them is really more likely than the other. And what if a trait is found universally throughout the in-group? Everyone in the in-group has it, but the out-group doesn't. Would you say this is probably ancestral? Or probably derived? Or, I guess, raise both your hands if you think we just can't tell. Yeah, I think so too. Again, there are two equally likely explanations for this distribution of traits. Maybe this green circle trait is ancestral, and so that's why everyone here in the in-group has the trait, because they all inherited it from a most recent common ancestor. And then at some point in time, the out-group lost the trait, because again, out-groups can evolve, just like in-groups can. But maybe the trait is derived. So maybe the shark doesn't have the trait because this guy does not have the trait. There's one evolutionary step happened maybe along this stretch of evolutionary time. The trait was gained in this lineage. So two equally likely explanations in that case. And so often using an outgroup can give us some confidence about whether a trait is derived or ancestral, but sometimes it can't. And you'll notice that this type of reasoning, I'm saying, oh, it's possible that there were like 3 independent appearances of the trait, but it's more likely that the trait is just ancestral or something. I am appealing to the principle of parsimony. I'm basically saying or assuming that the simplest possible explanation is probably the best. And if you're familiar with the idea of Occam's razor, this is a more general principle in philosophy, that if you have like multiple different explanations for anything, not just in phylogenetics, the simplest possible explanation is usually the best. We can apply parsimony or Occam's razor to phylogenetic analysis and say that if we have to choose between different evolutionary explanations, maybe two possible trees, two ways of depicting evolutionary relationships, or there's two possible character histories, this trait is derived or the trait is ancestral, whichever requires fewer evolutionary steps, fewer evolutionary changes, and by an evolutionary change, I mean the gain of a trait or the loss of a trait. Whichever explanation requires fewer of those is simpler and probably better, probably more likely to be correct. And this is how we can apply parsimony to phylogenetic analysis. So we can work through this using an example. So let's say that we know for sure that chickens and bats and chipmunks, they're all more closely related to each other than they are to frogs. So we are confident that frogs are the outgroup, but let's say we don't know whether bats are more closely related to chickens or to chipmunks. So we've got two different trees here, phylogenetic trees. We know frogs are less related to the other three than these three are to each other. But which of these trees is more likely to be correct? Which of these trees requires fewer evolutionary changes? And so remember that according to the principle of cladistics, we're not going to just pay attention to any old similarity between these species. We want to be paying attention to synapomorphies, to traits that are shared and derived. Okay? And so we go out and we catalog a number of traits, and we see which trait state each of the taxa have. So maybe the traits we want to look at are, lactation. Do these things have mammary glands and feed milk to their babies? Do they lactate? We'll also look at, do they have wings? Yes or no? Do they have fur? Yes or no? And do they have a beak? Yes or no? And so, yeah, the outgroup has like none of these things. Chickens have wings and beaks. Bats have lactation and fur. Chipmunks have lactation and fur. Okay. So clicker question. Of these four traits here, having lactation, having a beak, having wings, and not having fur, which of these are probably synapomorphies? I say probably, of course, because for this type of question, we're using an outgroup to determine whether a trait is derived or ancestral. You may not have 100% certainty. But you're often able to tell derived versus ancestral with reasonable confidence. Okay, so there's a couple hundred answers in. We'll just take a look. Take a look here. Okay, well that's interesting. All right, so let's go over these. Lactation, is it shared? Yes. Is it derived? Probably. Probably yes. So we would count lactation as a synapomorphy. Having a beak, is it shared? No, there's only one taxon that has a beak in this example. So number 2 is not a a synapomorphy. Number 3, having wings, is it shared? Yeah, bats have wings and chickens have wings. And is it derived? Probably, because wings is something that is not found in the outgroup. It is found in some of the in-group, so probably wings are derived. So we'll count wings as a synapomorphy. Having no fur is something that is shared. So frogs don't have fur and chickens don't have fur. But the absence of fur is probably an ancestral trait, not a derived trait. So no fur is actually a simplesiomorphy, not a synapomorphy, probably. Okay, so then lactation and wings are synapomorphies, so yeah, 1 and 3 are the correct answers here, yeah. Another synapomorphy that just doesn't fit into the constraint of multiple questions would be having fur. Fur is shared by 2 of these taxa, and it's probably derived. Okay, so now that we've identified some synapomorphies, having lactation, having wings, having fur, we can evaluate these 2 trees, and specifically, we can ask which one is more parsimonious, which one requires fewer evolutionary steps. So we have the distribution of wings and lactation and fur and on here. And we know that the most recent common ancestor probably didn't have any of them. We end up with chickens having wings, bats having fur and lactation and wings. Chipmunks having whatever chipmunks have. What do they have? Lactation and fur. One of these trees requires fewer evolutionary steps than the other, even though they both have the same number of taxa, the same number of branching events. One of them requires fewer gains of a trait. Let's take a look. Yes, people like tree A. Very good. I like it too. And even if you didn't already know that bats are more closely related to chipmunks, you could hopefully work that out simply by seeing that tree A is more parsimonious than tree B. So for tree A, for example, we need to get bats and chipmunks both possessing lactation. So we can have a single evolutionary step here. Maybe the trait of lactation is gained along the stretch of evolutionary time. We also know that chickens have wings, and this seems to be a derived trait, and bats also have wings. So for tree A, we need wings to evolve here and also here. That's a couple evolutionary steps. And we also know that bats and chipmunks have fur, but not the other 2 taxa, so fur may be evolved along this stretch of evolutionary time. So we can get to the distribution of traits in tree A in just 4 evolutionary steps, 4 gains or losses, but in this case, all of these are gains of a trait. Whereas to account for all of these traits in tree B, okay, so we need bats to evolve lactation. Maybe this happened at this point in evolutionary history because chickens don't have it. Chipmunks also need to evolve lactation, so that's another evolutionary step. Wings, okay, chickens and bats both have wings, and so maybe wings just evolved once here. And we also know that chipmunks have fur and bats have fur. So we need at least 5 evolutionary steps to account for this distribution of traits if tree B is correct. In other words, tree A requires fewer evolutionary steps, fewer gains or losses of a trait. So the tree on the left is more parsimonious, and we're going to say that the tree on the left is probably correct for that reason. So far, so good? All right. Okay, so things would be awesome for us as evolutionary biologists or as people looking at evolutionary relationships if all the similarities that we studied reflected recent common ancestry. And when that's the truth, when that's so, we say that these similarities are due to homology. So homologies are similarities that reflect recent common ancestry. These two taxa both have the same trait because they both inherited it from their most recent common ancestor. That would be a homology. However, you're already starting to become familiar with the idea that sometimes two or more taxa can have similarities that don't reflect homology. And we talked about this, for example, in the case of the in the case of convergent evolution between marsupial mammals, like this marsupial mole, and placental mammals, like the placental mole, back in the Life on Earth lecture. So these things are extremely distantly related to each other. They have some traits in common, like really, really tiny eye size and big flippers and claws that are well adapted to digging. But the reason they have those in common is not because the most recent common ancestor of these two things had those traits. The most recent common ancestor of these two things probably looked nothing like either of them and lived like 140 million years ago. These traits instead are similarities due to convergent evolution. So they both inhabit very similar selective environments. They have similar lifestyles adapted to digging underground. And so selection has just independently favored the same traits in both of these taxa. And so this similarity, we say, is not due to homology. We say that this similarity is due to convergent evolution. And there's many, many examples of convergent evolution out there. The evolution of wings and powered flight, for example, this has evolved independently in many different lineages, many different taxa. So once in the birds, at least once in the flying dinosaurs, once in the bats, again, multiple times in the insects, flying insects, which are not shown here. These things don't have wings because their most recent common ancestor had wings. They just have wings because they are adapted to similar lifestyles. Auditory vocal learning is another example of convergent evolution. So we as humans are sort of unusual among animals. Baby humans need to be exposed to human speech in order to learn language. Most animals don't have that. You can isolate a puppy from other dogs, and it will still learn to produce its species-typical vocalizations. But songbirds are another example of a taxon where there is auditory vocal learning. Baby birds need to be exposed to other birds of the same species to learn their songs and calls. So another example of convergent evolution. Oh, this is a fun example of convergent evolution. Having individually distinct fingerprints. No two humans have the same fingerprints. That is actually true for all the great apes. All the great apes have individually distinct fingerprints. One other type of animal also has individually distinct fingerprints. Does anyone know what it is? Yes. Koala bears, yes. And so on the left, we have koala bear fingerprints, and on the right are fingerprints from a human or a gorilla or some kind of ape. So I have heard from my Australian friends who may or may not be pulling my leg, I don't know, that koalas will sometimes come in and like contaminate crime scenes. There'll be like little fingerprints all over the place, but it's actually left by a koala and not by the murderer. So what is the selection pressure that has favored this trait? I don't know, but the product of convergent evolution. They're not similar due to homoplasy, due to homology, sorry. There's also been independent or convergent evolution of plants that smell like dead bodies or plants that smell like rotting flesh. So these two types of plants, both of them rely on flies to come in and pollinate them, so to take their pollen to another plant of the same species. These two plants are not closely related to each other, but they have both sort of independently or convergently stumbled on this solution that the best way to attract flies, if you're pollinated by flies, is to smell really, really horrible, to smell like something that's decaying, something that a fly would eat. So convergent evolution of bad smells in flowering plants. Convergent evolution of the camera eye. So we as vertebrate animals have an eye structure called a camera eye. This is distinct from the compound eye that many insects have. We are very, very distantly related to cephalopods like octopus and squid. But the octopus and squid, the cephalopods have independently evolved a camera eye very similar to our own. So it's not that vertebrate animals and cephalopods both inherited the camera eye from our most recent common ancestor. Instead, it has evolved different times in these two lineages. Oh yeah, and convergent evolution can also happen when we are looking at molecular traits. So maybe we're not looking at morphological traits to classify species. Maybe we just want to look at DNA sequence similarity. Convergent evolution can happen here too. So imagine that this phylogeny here, species A and B are sister taxa. This represents the true evolutionary relationships among these three species. But you can imagine a case in which there might be these blue hatches here represent convergent evolution. So both species B and species C independently change the second base position to a cytosine. Then if we were just looking at DNA sequence similarity, we would probably try and group species B and C together, say that they're sister taxa, but in fact, this similarity between B and C in their DNA sequence actually doesn't reflect recent common ancestry. So convergent evolution can happen in morphological traits. It can happen in molecular traits too, like DNA sequence. And convergent evolution is a type of homoplasy. So homoplasy is a more general term. It's the opposite of homology. And a homoplasy is either a misleading similarity or a misleading dissimilarity between taxa. Homoplasy is anything that causes you to support actually an incorrect phylogeny. So we're most familiar, I think, with the idea of convergent evolution. So here's another case of convergent evolution. Hippopotami are mammals and crocodiles are reptiles. Well, reptiles aren't a thing, but hippopotami and crocodiles are very distantly related to each other, but they have some important morphological similarities, including like the placement of the eyes very high up on their head. This is almost certainly not because the most recent common ancestor of these guys had that same eye placement. Instead, this high on the head eye placement seems to be the product of convergent evolution. Both of them are sit and wait predators that spend most of their time submerged underwater, and so a good place to have your eyes then is near the very top of your head. So it's a misleading similarity in this case. It's a trait that is very similar between two or more taxa, despite the fact that they're not actually very closely related. But the flip side of the coin, there's another way in which we can get homoplasy, and that is if there are species that are actually very closely related to each other, but that seem to be very different. So a misleading dissimilarity between things that are actually quite closely related to each other. So you might look at these 4 species of finch, these are Darwin's finches here, and if you were just examining like the morphology of their beak or the way they use their beak, you would say, oh, these things are nothing like each other. There's a finch that is like a vampire finch, and it uses its beak to poke mammals and suck their blood, and there's another finch that uses its beak to manipulate sticks. It's a tool-using finch. There are finches that use their beaks, that have very big beaks, that are adapted to cracking open large cactus seeds. There are finches that have like really small, nimble beaks that are great at snapping little midges out of the air. We might think that these things are not very closely related to each other at all, but in fact they are. They all had a most recent common ancestor, probably as little as just 2 million years ago, maybe less. So this is a case of divergent evolution. These lineages, or these traits in these lineages, have evolved so fast that you might look at them and say, yeah, they're not closely related, but they might actually be closely related. So there are two ways for homoplasy to occur. Homoplasy is just anything that tricks us or fools us or causes us to support the wrong phylogeny. So homoplasy is the enemy in phylogenetic analysis. We want to avoid using traits that are subject to homoplasy. And in a perfect world, we would only pay attention to traits that are similar because of homology, similarities that reflect recent common ancestry. Okay. So a homology is a trait that supports the correct phylogeny. A homoplasy is a trait that is misleading. And if you think back to the example that we worked out earlier in today's lecture, say, Beth, why did you make us study wings when we were looking at that? Because now, look, we can see, we know now that this is the right phylogeny, and you can see that wings are actually a homoplasious trait. So the fact that chickens and bats both have wings doesn't mean that chickens and bats both inherited wings from their most recent common ancestor. Instead, we think that wings must have evolved once in each of these lineages. So wings on this example are an example of convergent evolution. And if we had known that at the beginning of the class, then we wouldn't have looked at wings in the first place. So it's easy to say that in hindsight. It's more difficult to recognize whether similarity reflects common ancestry or convergent evolution if you don't know the phylogeny already. So if you don't know the phylogeny in advance, are there ways that we can recognize when similarity might reflect convergent evolution instead of common ancestry? Sometimes yes. Sometimes there are pretty good tells. So especially for morphological or structural traits, traits like the wings of a bat and the wings of a bird, like superficially in the shape of these structures, they look pretty similar. And in the function, yes, they do the same things, but they may be actually made out of different underlying anatomical structures. So maybe so in the case of bat wings, for example, the lifting surface is provided by like a thin membrane of skin. And the skin is stretched out between the bat's finger bones. These are like the bat's hands. So the bat is like flying around with like great big jazz hands like that. Whereas for a bird, even though the wings of the bird do the same thing as the wings of the bat, and they kind of look similar maybe in shape, the wings of a bird are composed of feathers. So these stiff keratin structures, and the feathers are coming off of the upper and lower arms and the wrist of the bird, instead of like the hands of the bird. So the underlying structures may be different. Or if we're looking at a trait and we know that the genes that are expressed in the development of the trait, you could say, okay, are the same genes being expressed in sort of roughly the same sequence in this taxon and that taxon? And if they are, then probably that similarity is due to recent common ancestry. Probably it's homologous. But if it's completely different genes underlying the development of a trait in this taxon and that taxon, then it's probably convergent evolution. Molecular traits like DNA sequence, similarity, it tends to be more difficult to recognize whether similarity is due to convergent evolution or to homology. In that case, we simply rely again on the principle of parsimony and say, hopefully, convergent evolution is fairly rare. And if I look at enough traits, then most of the similarities I see should be due to homology. And so that will hopefully wipe out the signal, any error of homoplasy. Okay, so for the last 10 minutes, I want to just work through as many of these exam questions as we can. And so this is a typical setup for an exam question that you might see. We'll have some multiple choice and then some short answer questions, just taken from a previous final exam. I would give you a trait table, something like this. I'd give you a number of traits, and I'd tell you which taxon is the outgroup, and I'd say which traits the outgroup has and which traits each of the in-group taxa have. And I might ask you eventually to label what's the tips of the phylogeny. So we might start off with just recognizing which traits are probably ancestral. And you can use outgroup analysis to do that. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. And you're welcome to confer quietly with your neighbor if you want. If you're feeling really, really, really spicy and you just want to see if you can solve it on your own, that's awesome. Try and solve it on your own. I'll give you a minute to do that. So the common ancestor of this whole group, even including the outgroup, and yeah, for questions like this on the exam, I will be using terms like probably or most likely. Because again, we don't know, using outgroup analysis with 100% certainty, which traits are ancestral or derived. But we can make informed guesses. Nice, okay, yeah, D is the correct answer here. The common ancestor of this whole group probably had jaws. So you can see jaws is a trait that is present in the outgroup, and it's present in some of the in-group, but not all of the in-group. Common ancestor probably did not have horns, because horns are found in some of the in-group, but not the outgroup. Horns are probably a derived trait. The common ancestor of all of these guys, it probably had stripes instead of spots. Again, based on this distribution of traits. So spots is probably a derived state, not an ancestral state. Common ancestor probably did not have long fur. Long fur probably evolved just once in this lineage here. Okay, can you recognize or remember what an autapomorphy is? Which of these traits, shown here, is most likely to be an autapomorphy? Remember, autapomorphies are unique. They're only found in one taxon, and they're derived. So the only two traits that could be autapomorphies are A and E, because the other traits listed here are not unique. Yeah, okay, and people like A and E. Long fur is most likely to be an autapomorphy on here. So could 5 toes be an autapomorphy? That is, could 5 toes be derived as well as unique? Yes, it's possible, but it's sort of a coin flip. It's equally likely that the most recent common ancestor of this whole gang had 5 toes or that it had 1 toe. So that one is sort of a coin flip. But we can say that probably the most recent common ancestor for this whole group had short fur, not long fur. So long fur is probably a derived trait. Question or just a stretch? Stretch? Okay. Sorry, you had a question?
I was just wondering, like, just knowing what we would think of.
Could I explain more about the? I explained. Okay, good. Okay, so it's really key to recognize synapomorphies when we are trying to, eventually we're working towards constructing a phylogeny. So, let's, good old multiple. Which of these traits are probably synapomorphies? So which of them are shared and probably derived? Okay, so got a lot of answers in here. Nice, okay, yeah. A is the correct answer here. So horns are shared and probably derived. Spots are shared by B and D, and they're probably derived, because the outgroup doesn't have them, but some of the in-group do. Having no jaws is shared by B, C, D, and it's probably derived because of this. And yeah, having long fur is not shared, so it can't be a synapomorphy. So A, 1, 2, and 3 is the correct answer here. And now the final thing to do would be to recognize which species probably branched off first, and then at what stretches in evolutionary time do we see like the appearance of spots or the disappearance of jaws? So looking at these synapomorphies, thoughts about which taxon probably branched off first? A, B, C, or D? Who do we think probably branched off first? Is there a taxon here that seems to share fewer synapomorphies with the other? I'm hearing A, excellent, okay. What about the next species to branch off? C, yes, excellent, okay. And then after that, there's just B and D left, and it doesn't, you could write B here and D here, or D here and B here. It just makes no difference. So this could be D and this could be B. It would be telling you exactly the same thing. And so you have now used this trait table to reconstruct the most likely evolutionary history of these organisms. When do we think that spots probably appeared? Where do you think? Think about where you would draw the appearance of spots on this, yeah. Like in this section here, after C branched off, but before B and D diverged from each other? Yeah, I agree, okay. So the most likely appearance of spots is somewhere in this stretch of evolutionary time. That's why B and D have spots, probably. And when did jaws disappear? Well, we know that B, C, and D don't have jaws, and so again, the simplest explanation is probably sometime in this stretch of evolutionary time, jaws would have disappeared. Okay, that's literally all I know about phylogenies, and now you guys know it too, so go out and do great things on the quiz. Have a great weekend. Thanks, guys.